Hello everyone, this is Shruti from Document 360, the co-organizer of the webinar. Thank you for joining this session today. We are just as excited as you are for this session. Our guest today is Sofia Emilianova, joining us from London, UK. She is a technical writer at Google. Going to borrow her own words here. She teaches everyone how to use complex software. So she is also an experienced information developer and a knowledge architect. She has developed talks for wide audiences with various level of tech skills and created and maintained information architectures and content strategies for industry leading products. Thank you, Sophia, for accepting our invite and coming here to share insights. Today, she will be speaking on the topic documenting large scale and complex products. She will cover documenting Chrome developer tools and how to navigate the most complex documentation projects you may encounter in your documentation. Thank you. Sophia, you can start the session now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my webinar on documenting large-scale and complex products. Thank you, Shruti. I hope I pronounced your name correctly
Yes.
for a great introduction. But let me go over it just one last time so that I don't, jump off my script. So, my name is Sophia. And I have been working on Chrome developer tools for about a year and a half. And I am the owner of Chrome developer tools documentation. And by owner, I mean that firstly, I'm the key contributor. And secondly, whenever our team gets extra headcount or funding, I work with and direct fellow tech writers, temporary contractors, and docs as a service vendors. Basically, I'm the contributor, reviewer, and maintainer of this enormous documentation set. Now, firstly, who is this webinar going to be beneficial for? I think that it's going to be beneficial for those tech writers who face insurmountable tasks, but still want to learn how to divide and conquer. But also for those who want to bring order to chaos, expand your influence on your team, and advance your technical writing career. And lastly, I think it's also be beneficial for those who just want to work less, but do more. So this is an overview, a high-level overview of the topics that I'll touch upon in this webinar, although not necessarily in this order. So we're going to talk about scoping, prioritization, information architecture, content strategy, negotiating with management for extra resources, fitting yourself into a team of engineers, and the basics of delegation. The one thing that I'm not going to touch upon is interviewing candidates, because to the best of my knowledge, the industry still doesn't know how to do that, and neither do I. So first, as fellow technical writers, you're probably familiar with the first step. It's the research. We do it for every new thing that comes our way and that we have to document. But when you're tackling a big and complex documentation project on your own or as a part of a team that is struggling, you want to start with an eagle-eye view of the whole thing first, then narrow down to smaller facets or aspects, decompose the most complex aspects, and finally zero in on details. And the natural logical continuation of that process would be to then set your documentation goals and log your tasks into a bug tracker. But before logging, it's a bit early for that because there's a blocker that we need to solve first. The first thing that you need is a sound information architecture, both if you start from scratch or if you are fixing a messy legacy architecture that you may have inherited. So what's information architecture? Well, it's a bit hard to define. if you ask 3 knowledgeable persons, you might end up with 4 opinions. But here's how I define it for myself. Basically, it's 3 things: documentation structure, the user experience of documentation, and discoverability of information. In this webinar, I'm going to focus on the first aspect because it's a blocker for everything else. The doc structure, of course, can be further broken down into more aspects. For example, it's also about the documentation types that you need and how you choose them to meet your documentation goals. For example, do you have an API? Maybe you need an API reference. It's a or is the product that you're building a complicated platform that developers are supposed to build upon, and therefore you need tutorials with code samples, best practices, and an SDK? Or is it supposed to be an out-of-the-box consumer solution, and you need an FAQ section to fix users' problems for them, and as a consequence, offload the customer support team? Well, because we're already past the research stage, so I assume that you studied your product, you might already have an idea. So the next thing is to put together all of those documents that you need to create into a structure. And it's a blocker because to start creating content, you've got to know what goes where. Or if you're dealing with a messy legacy documentation set, you might not understand the intention behind the existing structure because people have left and taken their tribal knowledge with them. So anyway, it doesn't really matter what was the intention. In this case, you can figure out your own structure and do an overhaul. So structure. The structure should both follow and guide the user journey. And what do I mean by that? Well, you might start with following the user journey first. You need to talk to the subject matter experts and figure out what the ideal user journey should look like for your product. The user journey is basically a set of steps on a high level that the user is supposed to perform when they interact with your product. Then, as you learn more about the product, you will find better ways of doing things. So you'll start figuring out the most efficient happy paths that the users may not be aware of. So this is what I mean by guiding the user. You should document those because you know better than anyone else, because you are the first user and you are the user advocate. For example, before I joined the Chrome team, I worked at Google Cloud on a service called Cloud Data Catalog. If you want to look up the documentation set that I worked on, I believe it has been merged with other services in the cloud and it's now part of Cloud Dataplex. So Data Catalog was and still is a metadata management service. In this service, in this metadata service database, companies who use cloud, they store their metadata there, and metadata is just data about data, about in their internal systems and databases, including the legacy ones and the on-premises ones that they have. So this is the rough set of steps that you perform when you use Data Catalog. So what you do is you integrate the systems that you have, legacy, on-premises, and those in Google Cloud. Then you create, store, and maintain your metadata. Then you search for metadata, and it's complicated a little bit. And lastly, you control access to the metadata service for the internal users of your company that are supposed to have access to it. So it's a not such a complicated high-level user journey. So it would be logical to reflect this structure in the table of contents, which is what you see on the screen right now. But only 3 of those sections are still there in the table of contents because others were reimagined and merged to comply with other cloud systems that data catalog is now a part of. Now, I was under the impression that I have my structure strategy figured out for my entire career by following the simple hack of defining a high-level user journey. But then I transferred to Chrome. And I realized, once again, that apparently I am Jon Snow and I know nothing. Because developer tools are supposed to help you debug everything on the web. And there is no high-level, all-encompassing user journey. You can debug front-end, back-end, CSS, JavaScript, networking, storage, background services. You can boost performance, you can do various audits, you can capture and replay user interactions, and more and more and more. And also you can debug WebAssembly, which is a very niche but important thing, and don't ask me what it is. I'm just going to wait for the end of the video. There it is. So how do you document this? You don't have a high-level user journey. Instead, you have a collection of pieces of workflows, and web developers integrate these pieces into their overall workflow. So we need to help them find the right pieces. So the document structure might even follow the UI, at least at the first level of the table of contents. And I, as the first user, as a web developer myself, I may not know what this particular checkbox in DevTools does in the network panel. So I Google something like DevTools network panel checkbox name, and hopefully then I'll be able to find out what the checkbox does from the first search result. And this is one section of the table of contents. Most of the sections describe each panel separately. And I think there are more than 30 panels in DevTools. I haven't checked recently. Some of them are small, some are big. This is one of the big ones, the sources panel. Unfortunately, as of now, not all of them are documented. So previously I thought that if a table of contents follows the UI elements, panels one by one in this case, it can't possibly result in a good documentation because it's just a UI reference then. How can it guide the user? Well, turns out that with super complex things, the user may start the search for information with the UI elements. So it's fine to organize these things this way, at least at a high level, as long as it follows the natural flow of information discovery. So my advice to you regarding structure is you should keep an open mind when it comes to it. Next up is the content strategy. Again, it can be hard to define, and here's how I define it for myself. If simplified, there are 3 aspects. Now, since we've got ourselves a structure, we now know what should go where. So now we can start planning, developing, and managing content. And to do that, now is the time to log the documentation tasks that we discovered by researching the product and by talking to subject matter experts. Then we should log all the tasks that we come up with into the bug tracker. Don't restrain yourself in any way. Log whatever you think is supposed to be done, however long it's going to take. In fact, if later you figure out more things to do, you should revise, and log more things in. You're gonna wanna spend time doing this. Here's what I like to do when I log things. I assign t-shirt sizes to decompose tasks. And I do it based on my own experience of how long it takes for me to research and document a new thing of medium complexity. By a task of S size, I typically mean at least an hour. I also encourage you to avoid the Excel size tasks, logging them, because it's just an indicator that you didn't decompose enough. Next, I divide the workload into several, as I call them, streams. The new content stream is a series of tasks you need to do to cover all of the upcoming stuff with documentation. The content update stream is a series of tasks that you need to do to fix, update old documentation and legacy documentation, or document what's already been released but is missing documentation. The organizational work is everything that I've already talked about and will talk about in this webinar. And the miscellaneous stuff is an optional category for urgent requests that come from management that cannot be postponed. And once I have a reasonable amount of decomposed tasks in each stream, I log them in the bug tracker. I fall back to using one of the most well-known prioritization frameworks, the Eisenhower matrix. So if you don't know about the Eisenhower matrix, here's what it looks like. It's super simple. There are two dimensions, urgency and importance. If a task is important and urgent, you should do it right away. If it's important but not urgent, you should schedule it. If it's not important but urgent, you should delegate. And then if you have a big backlog of tasks logged into a bug tracker, some of them naturally, by not being prioritized into other three categories, will end up in the red category, which means that at some point in time the task becomes outdated and not needed. So you put a won't do status to it and provide a reason. So now go ahead and create some content and then immediately log your progress. It is probably common knowledge that when your manager is asking you to log things, especially timings, they're probably not using a great management style. Luckily, I haven't been asked to log timings in a long while in my career, but I have decided to do it myself, and there are two specific reasons for it. First of all, even if the manager didn't ask for it, it's what they will be able to immediately understand. Second, when you illustrate your progress, and I suggest that you explore using the so-called Gantt chart for this purpose, one important, for the lack of a better word, characteristic of your work also becomes apparent and transparent. I'm going to talk. I'm going to tell you what it is right away. This is a mocked snippet of a snippet of my workload in a span of several weeks. I suggest that you do a new chart per month or per quarter. The Gantt chart is divided into 4 streams that I talked about: new content, updates, org work, and miscellaneous. I typically log tasks that take me several hours so that I don't get bored of logging, which I round up to half a day because I do extra routine like emails and meetings that I don't log. And then I make sure to spend some time on each stream each week, or bi-weekly at least, with occasional exception. of the miscellaneous category because it's ad hoc. If I don't spend time on each category in the span of a month, then it means that either I'm unable to keep up with the current state of development, or my backlog of outdated or missing docs doesn't decrease, which is not good, or I'm unable to bring structure to chaos if I don't do my organizational work. The Gantt chart lets you log the so-called dependencies, which are the vertical arrows that jump from one progress bar to another. In my case, I'm a bit repurposing the dependencies feature of the Gantt chart because the tasks connected with arrows are not necessarily blockers from the product point of view. They are, however, blockers for my focus. So this chart illustrates exactly what I want to show because it looks like a cardiogram of a person with a heart condition. This brings us to the potential rebuttal that you might hear from your manager, which might sound something like, having to do multitasking is a harsh reality of the modern world. Wasn't multitasking on the list of skills in your resume? Well, multitasking is a myth. Even computer processors don't actually do multitasking because what seems like multitasking is in reality rapid context switching. Context switching comes with additional cognitive load that costs us time, productivity, and makes us error prone. And it's all backed up by actual scientific studies. So in order to stay productive, I'm doing my best to keep a worklog of tasks decomposed to a point that they take me no less than an hour, preferably several. And then I make sure that I have ample time to put in some deep work in the most important ones, and I also batch minor things together. Now, I suggest that you attempt to explain all of these things to your manager and do even more. Have a regular one-on-one with them. Explain the importance of documentation for the product and educate them on context switching and the fact that minimizing it is crucial for your productivity. Also explain what you're doing under the organizational work category and how it's necessary to be able to do more with less. Once they get the picture, it's time to negotiate it for more resources. Don't hesitate to ask for any of those three things: more full-time technical writers, or temporary contractors, or some funding for buying docs as a service vendor services. Now there may be different situations, a different economic climate like the one that we're in right now, funding constraints, etc. And the manager might not be able to get you additional resources. But at the very least, the work you're doing is now transparent, and you always have a solid reason why it may be too optimistic to commit to certain deadlines. However, you should never agree to do overtime, which is another potential request for your management after this talk. And the reason is, the moment you first do it, it kind of becomes normalized in managers' view, and they start expecting it over and over again. And in the long run, it's unsustainable and leads to burnout, which both you and your manager don't want. So it might be a good idea to get on the same page about this one with your manager as well. So to recap, now you have a framework that lets you manage everything that comes your way. You're able to plan ahead. You hopefully have reached an understanding with your manager. And if your negotiation was successful, you're almost prepared for potential task delegation. because now you know what goes where. You have a backlog of tasks, and you can scope and prioritize it. One more thing you need to do before you get to delegation, if you managed, in fact, to get some help, is to prepare an onboarding process. And well, since we're writers, you might as well start with an onboarding document. And this document should contain the following things at the minimum, which is a workflow, a step-by-step workflow description, a list of subject matter experts to talk to with their respective areas, the go-to people, in other words, and the company-specific know-hows or tribal knowledge, whatever that may mean for your company. And lastly, a style guide, um, which you should either create, or if you don't, or you just can adopt one, because there are a lot of good ones online. Now, before we touch on the last topic, which is delegation, here's a bonus thing you can do to make your work easier. It is also a part of the organizational workflow work category that I talked about. First off, not all of the engineers ever worked with a technical writer and know what to expect from a technical writer. So I usually do an intro presentation for the team, where I talk about why documentation is important, and I explain to them that docs are a part of the product. And I also like to recite the following quote: if something isn't documented, it doesn't exist. Then I walk the engineers through the workflow of a technical writer and explain that despite the word writer in the title, I usually actually spend about 30% of my time actually writing, because the rest is spent on research, interviewing subject matter experts, and other organizational work. And then I attempt to explain how to work with a tech writer efficiently. And for that, I usually show the developers the following slide. I make sure to tell them that all features are unique and thus require a unique approach. But most of the time, among the questions that I ask are those 5. And by the way, to minimize the amount of distractions that I, tech writer, will inevitably cause you, the engineer, when I come to you with questions, so you can actually answer all of them in advance in design docs, for example, or in clear commit messages. So when you help a tech writer, you actually help yourself. This is what I tell the engineers. The problem with this educational effort is that in the real world, the engineers still don't answer the questions in advance, and they tend to forget about you, the tech writer, anyway. The intro presentation doesn't really work the way it's intended. What it does instead is, at the very least, it raises your visibility within the team, and it makes you recognizable. So if this doesn't work, what works better then? I think that what works better is to explain the same things, the importance of documentation and what to expect from a tech writer, to the engineering leads face-to-face in a one-on-one, and then kindly ask them to become your advocate about this matters in the team. It's easier for a lead to remember about you than for the entire team of engineers. But in the end, I still always end up having to familiarize myself with the code base and read the commit logs myself and learn to understand the engineer speak. But it's just that it takes time. because if you manage to do it, your core work becomes more efficient. For example, I have some experience in UX writing, so I started contributing to the Chromium open source project with an effort to improve the UI texts there. Because at the end of the day, the clearer the UI texts are, the less I have to explain in documentation. As a result, engineers started interacting with me during feature development. They ask for my expertise and they add me as a reviewer to their CLs whenever they craft the UI and have to write UI text because they need my UX writing expertise, which was a great result for me because I managed to integrate myself into the development cycle, raised awareness and influence. Finally, to probably the most important part of this webinar that we have been building towards this whole time. Now we're ready to delegate, assuming that we did manage to get additional help from management. Here's the first of the 8 delegation tips that I'm going to share. They're all based on my experience, and they are the knowledge that has crystallized in my head over the entirety of my career. First, set up what I call a progress vector, which basically means 3 things. Explain the current state of affairs, paint a picture of a perfect world, and outline your current plan on how to get there. And while you're doing that, don't forget to welcome the ideas on how to improve the plan from your directs. Second, make your expectations clear. In its simplest form, it can mean that you show your directs the best piece of work as an example, walk them through why you think it's the best, and encourage them to read through and always check the style guide and to make the content that you create consistent. Third one, provide mentorship. In its basic form, it means that you should regularly ask what the pain points are for your directs, how you can help, what resources you can provide to make things better. What I also like to do is sometimes I invite people to do shadow writing or pair writing. Shadow writing is when I write a documentation live and provide commentary, and the other person sees my screen and asks questions, and I always make sure to remind them that stupid questions don't exist. Pair writing is similar to pair coding that engineers sometimes do. It's when people collaborate on one piece live. Next, delegate only the tasks that you know how to do. And there are 2 reasons for it. First, it's a bad idea to teach people how to swim by dropping them into the water without support. Second, if you know how to do the task, you'll be able to efficiently review the result in no time. 5. Tip number 5, agree on a timeline. Unfortunately, it's necessary to get things done because publicly stated commitment actually does increase the success rate. But you can't do it on your own. You can't yourself set the timeline. You have to arrive at a consensus together. Now, I understand that people hate when they're asked how much time something's going to take because it's guesswork. The best piece of advice that I can give on that is you don't want a failure to meet deadlines to sound like it's the end of the world. The vibe that you're looking for should be more like, look, I've got to figure out a reasonable time frame. I understand that guesswork is very difficult. If we fail the time frame, the failure is mine alone. We'll adjust accordingly next time. So help me out here, friend. And make sure that that they understand that mistakes are not the end of the world, and that you'll shield them as much as you can, so that you can hopefully have a good working relationship with your report, and you can both help each other out. Next, you should reward effort and not outcome. And the simple reason is that it changes the mindset from will I be successful to what should I attempt? And it's a pretty stark change in the mindset, and you might be surprised with the results. Another important thing, and I want to make clear that it's my own humble personal opinion, there should only be carrots and never sticks. Something goes wrong, and you take the blame. Then you explain the consequences that you've experienced, and help your direct empathize with you. Then together you figure out how to prevent it in the future. Are you familiar with the saying that employees don't quit positions, they quit their bosses? Well, it's because both positive and negative vibes compound in human interactions. So if you don't stop the negatives at your level, this is what happens. Also, if this doesn't work upstream, meaning with your manager, that might be a potential red flag. Last but not least, you've got to trust and let go. In other words, don't micromanage. And I think this aspect is closely related with how much of a perfectionist you are yourself. And the fastest way to stop micromanaging is to realize that 80% perfection is good enough. You're never going to achieve 100% perfection. You're going to wait forever for that to happen. And if you push, that's what makes it hard for everyone. Here's a recap of all the 8 delegation tips in one slide in case you ever want to double check. And that was the last slide of my webinar.
Thank you, Sophia, for taking the time from your busy schedule and sharing your knowledge with us. On behalf of entire Document 360, I thank everyone who joined the session and hope it was a great session for you all. Thank you. We'll be back again with yet another session very soon. Goodbye. Thank you.